A warm welcome to everyone listening. I am so excited about today's conversation. My guest is Andrew Whitehead, one of the foremost scholars of Christian nationalism in the United States. He's an associate professor of sociology and director of the Association of Religion Data Archives, the ARDA.com, and the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture at the Purdue University Indianapolis, IUPUI. He's also the lead author of Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States, which came out in 2020, along with Samuel Perry, which won the 2021 Distinguished Book Award for Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. And his next book, American Idolatry, How Christian Nationalism Betrays the Gospel and Threatens the Church, is due out in 2023. Andrew Whitehead, welcome to Wider Angle.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here.
So, Andrew, in order to understand this whole cultural framework of Christian nationalism and this peculiar conception of Christianity's relationship to American identity and civic life and the reactions against it, let's start with definitions from the how do you define Christian nationalism? And do Americans even agree on what Christian nationalist means?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, in our book and a lot of our writing, we define Christian nationalism as, like you said, a cultural framework that idealizes and advocates for a close fusion of a particular expression of Christianity with American civic life. And so in the US, there are many different expressions of Christianity, lots of different Christian groups, but this one tends to be much more ethnocentric and politically and religiously conservative. And wanting to see this type of Christianity really provide the framework for how the US should function and have the U.S. government at different levels really advocate and defend this framework as well. So that's the way that we describe it. And we aren't just making that definition up out of thin air. The way we came to that definition is through a lot of this empirical research where we see these questions about how Americans respond to whether the government should declare the U.S. a Christian nation or should advocate Christian values. The people that really agree with those, they tend to see the world in a very particular way. And so that's how we build this definition. Now, whether Americans agree upon a definition, I think there's a lot of variation there. And so the term Christian nationalism and Christian nationalists has really started to be more a part of the discourse in the last 5 to 6 months, pretty much since Marjorie Taylor Greene, the Congresswoman from Georgia, said, I'm a Christian nationalist. Then it really took off. But a recent Pew study that came out right at the end of October, they were asking Americans, what if they believe the U.S. should be a Christian nation, those types of things. And some really interesting findings they had is that for some Americans, well, basically their main finding is there is a lot of variation. So for some Americans, when they talk about a Christian nation, it means, well, just generally, we should abide by Christian values. For others, it is much more of a making sure that Christianity is privileged and, kind of supreme in the public sphere. So with that too, there's variation and a lot going on out in the public.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was going to ask you what quantitative data have you used to get the picture also about the Christian nationalists? And was it the same survey? There was also First National Survey that you and Samuel Perry did as well. I thought that was fascinating. So I'm curious to hear, where are most Americans on this idea about U.S. being or should be a Christian nation? Can you tell us a little bit about the quantitative data that you
Yeah, for sure, I'd love to. Yeah, that's the fascinating part. Within the last 5 or 6 years, there have been a lot of different national surveys, and there are a number of ways that we measure Christian nationalism. We use a number of different measures, and not just Sam and I, but other folks working in this area. So within our book, we have 6 different questions that kind of get at this idea of how closely Christianity should be intertwined and given privilege in the public sphere. And we create a scale. We also use a question in our book that has been asked a number of different times on a large national survey that asks Americans essentially, how important is it to being a true American to be Christian? So they could say it's very important or not very important or somewhat important. So this is kind of looking at, do they see Christianity or being a Christian as a key part of being what it means to be truly American? And then, like you said, Sam and a colleague of his, Joshua Grubbs, they gathered national data just recently, where they actually asked the sample, how well does the, term Christian nationalist define you? And people could say very well or somewhat well, that type of thing. And what they found was when they looked at, how well it described them, about 25% of American adults said that Christian nationalists described them very or somewhat well, which really kind of maps onto other ways that we've measured this, where we're not asking them, do you identify as a Christian nationalist, but looking at some different beliefs and values that people have. And so in different ways that we've looked at this, we see 15% of Americans strongly embrace Christian nationalism. When we look at values and beliefs, we ask if they identify as a Christian nationalist. At least one survey, which of course we need to gather more data to confirm it, says around a quarter. So if we're looking at the number of Americans that believe and think that Christianity is a key part of America, American ideals, should be a key part of our government, should be privileged in the public sphere, we see 15 to 25% of Americans are in some way or another supportive of that outlook.
Did those numbers surprise you as somebody who's been studying it very closely?
I would say that the recent data that Sam and Joshua Grubbs gathered, where they're asking, does Christian nationalists describe you? They found about 11% said it described them very well. And I guess that didn't surprise me too much. I could see where 1 out of 10 Americans would say that based on what we found. And pairing them both together, it was right in that. But I guess it's still, it isn't surprising, but yet just to see it laid out there and empirically shown, that there's a part of me still that is still kind of surprised. So I guess I'm not really answering your question. Whenever we get new data, I think that's what's always fascinating. Is okay, what's happening now? Where are things at now? And that's, I guess, part of the fun part of the job too. So it's interesting. And the recent Pew study, when they asked Americans, should the United States be a Christian nation, about 45% said yes. And so if we just look at should, not is it, or do we have to demand it, but just should, there's a lot of Americans that are thinking in these terms.
But then there's a very important caveat in the book where you explain that it is important to crystallize that you're not necessarily talking about evangelicalism or white conservative Protestantism when you talk about Christian nationalism, right?
Yeah, that's a point we try to make in the book, and that we find over and over, is that while a lot of white evangelicals, or even if we expand that to white Christians, a majority of them do embrace Christian nationalism to some extent. And there's a lot of those folks that embrace it strongly. It isn't just found within that religious tradition. We find that there are about 20-25% of white evangelicals and a larger number of, if we expand it to white Christians, so including white mainline Protestants or white Catholics, that resist or reject Christian nationalism, that don't want to see Christianity privileged in the public sphere. And so, again, these aren't just one and the same, but the caveat to that is white evangelicalism and white Christianity. That's kind of those are the cultural institutions that produce and perpetuate this cultural framework. But what we find and what we argue is that it diffuses across the population, so that we actually find Christian nationalism outside of those institutional spaces as well, which is really fascinating and kind of points to that this isn't just a religious thing, that it really is about the public sphere and religion and power, and who has the right to say what is and what should be.
Yeah, so that's a perfect segue to the next question, because I was going to ask you, what are some of the assumptions that Christian nationalism includes? Either beliefs and values related to religion, as you say and write in the book, there are some obviously parts of Christian nationalism that inspire or that are inspired, I guess, by parts of the Bible, like you write. But then there's a lot more than religion going on, right? So what do they believe besides that point that we addressed about United States being or should be Christian nation?
Yeah, definitely. So when we're looking at this, there are aspects of, the Orthodox Christian faith, and many of the folks that embrace Christian nationalism, are Christians. It isn't as though we're saying if they're Christian nationalists or embrace it, they aren't. They are. And so, some of the historic Orthodox creeds of the Christian faith they would assent to and are part of churches and all these things. But what we find and what we argue is that Christian nationalism not only contains some of those aspects of the Christian faith, but then there are these cultural elements that are added to it. And so these cultural elements include a number of different things. And again, we find these to be true based on how strongly somebody embraces Christian nationalism. We see what they believe and what they hold to, their attitudes. So one of the elements with Christian nationalism that sets it apart from other expressions of Christianity is a very strong sense of moral traditionalism, that the world is and should be designed according to sustaining social hierarchies. So who is at the top, who's in the middle, and who's at the bottom. And generally this revolves around gender and sexuality. So very traditional gender norms and sexuality norms. So heterosexuality, mom and a dad in every family, men are the leaders in the family and in the public sphere. And this is how we basically should create and embrace, our social world. The second element is a real comfort with authoritarian social control. So the idea is that the world's a chaotic place, and sometimes we need strong leaders, strong men, to take control and ensure that everyone's kept safe and maintain order, and through violence, or at least the threat of violence, to maintain that order. And then the final element is really strict ethno-racial boundaries around national identity, civic participation, and social belonging. So this means that when we're talking about, and when they're talking about a Christian nation, in those questions we ask, it never says anything about race. But what we find over and over is that Americans, especially white Americans, as they agree with some of these measures, we find that they are much more likely to say that really to be a true American, or to really fall in to line with being a true American is being white and whiteness, and much more likely to fear racial and ethnic minorities, to oppose, for instance, interracial marriage or transracial adoption, or believe that there is no racial injustice in our criminal justice system, those types of things. So when we look at it all together with these different elements of Christian nationalism, it has this it's talking, in terms of Christianity, but all these other elements kind of come with it, and these cultural expressions are a part of it as well, and that's where it really is powerful in shaping how people see their worlds around them.
And that is why it impacts the polarization in society as well, right?
Yeah, definitely. So that's some of what we argue, is that while Christian nationalism is not even close to being the only explanation for why there is so much polarization culturally and politically, we do think it is a key part, because for Americans that embrace it versus those that don't, they really are seeing the world in drastically different ways, and thinking about politics and the role of personal faith or no faith, right? If they're secular, they really see it differently. And so that, I think, becomes very difficult. Because if we think about it from the side of those that embrace Christian nationalism, if they believe, as many do and as many have said, that God has a particular plan for our nation, and for our nation to stay aligned with that plan, we have to follow God's commands. And again, this group knows what those commands are. Why would you allow anything else to happen other than those things coming to pass? Even if it means setting aside democracy, right? Giving other groups say, if God has commanded it, in their minds, we have to follow. And so that's really powerful. And I think it leads a lot to, again, what we argue with polarization is seeing the other side as not having equal rights, right, in a democracy, in a public sphere, and that the book How Democracies Die, that's one of the guardrails of democracy is whoever your opponent is, giving basically saying they have equal right to have a say, right, and abiding by results of, let's say, elections, those types of things. So yeah, to understand polarization, I do think religion, especially public expressions of religion like Christian nationalism, really important. And that's what we argue throughout that book.
And that self-righteousness that comes out, that taps power, I mean, the power of religion and the legitimacy of those arguments is something that is used by many within and from other religions as well. But we'll talk a little bit about it. I'm just very familiar with that sort of sentiment of us versus them, bolstered by God being on our side. And I really enjoyed reading in your book particular arguments related to that point about, but we'll talk about it in a bit. You make a very important distinction about influential post-millennial and premillennial advocates of Christian nationalism. I thought that was very interesting. We don't necessarily think about it, or at least those of us who are not immersed into that scholarship and realities. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think the key here too is that when we look at the American public, many people wouldn't know what those two terms are. It wouldn't really make sense to them. And I think for many folks, they actually adopt aspects of both. And so we're talking about, whether Christians should work for and are going to be able to basically remake the world, and doing that in a way that aligns with God's values, that will bring kind of the rapture of the second coming. So post-millennials or premillennial is that the world's going to hell in a handbasket. There's nothing you're going to do to stop it. You just need to remain faithful, and then Jesus is going to come back, rapture up Christians and take them away. And we do find that there are influential leaders who have kind of adhered to one or the other, but then are advocates of Christian nationalism, or at least a form of it in some way. But I think for most Americans, the people in the pews, we could say, they're going to kind of adopt and take different aspects of each one and use it kind of as needed. And really, if we look at in the 90s, the Left Behind series, those series of books that were written, those are really influential. So millions, tens of millions of Christians read those. And so I think too, taking into account that cultural influence, many American Christians now really do abide by a premillennial interpretation because of those books that were so influential. So there's a lot of things happening here. And I think for me, I see it more as most American Christians kind of have a hodgepodge of views that they adopt from both camps. And it really, I think the point too is that it doesn't matter if you're pre or post, you can still embrace this cultural framework, and you might just have different reasons for why, but this framework kind of helps bring both together into one kind of coherent whole.
And they embrace it because regardless of the group, they all feel fear of something, right? I think fear is very prominent in your book, and let's talk about it. Let's talk about the power of fear. Actually, we'll talk about the power as well, and fear, and now power of fear. So what does this group of Americans feel threatened and marginalized about? And this goes beyond religious identity, right?
Yeah, it does. And I appreciate this conversation because in my next book, I talk about three of the main idols of Christian nationalism. The first is power, which, like you said, we've talked about. The second is fear, and then the third is violence. And so with fear, viewing power as a zero-sum game where if I have more, you have less, or if you have more, I have less. And that's the only way it works. Then when I have privilege and power, I'm going to be afraid of losing that. And so what do I need to do to maintain it? And so fear has been a consistent part of our religious heritage in the US, primarily Christian heritage because of who came from Europe and then pushing out native and indigenous populations. But there's a particular political rhetoric, the Jeremiad, where they're saying, we used to be this type of people, but we've fallen away. And here are the reasons that we've fallen away. But now we could return to this mythic past and this incredible past if we do these things. And really what that's always going to do is highlight fear and threat, that we should be afraid that we've fallen away or that we could fall away, but here's what you need to do to get back. And so political and religious leaders, and this happens on both, sides of the political aisle and in different religious traditions. It isn't just one, but we can see it over and over as being really powerful within those that embrace Christian nationalism. You could look at Make America Great Again as a Jeremiad, right? Like, we had this mythic great past. Look at us now and all the terms that Trump and others will use. Even when he, I don't know when this will air, but he just threw his hat in the ring for 2024 as a presidential candidate, and he's doing the same thing where look how horrible it all is, but we can get back. And guess how we get back? Well, it's voting for me. I will return us to power and do all those things. And so fear is a key part. And then too, just one last point on fear, is that there's some interesting work, an interesting paper that came out looking at for adolescents moving through early adolescence into young adulthood. A researcher who's now at the Pew Research Institute, Michael Rotolo, he looked at some of the interviews of these young people, and he found that fear was one of the key aspects of their journey, for those feeling anger, but then also fear, of moving these young adults to embrace Christian nationalism more strongly as they got older, whether it's fear in their individual lives or just being afraid of change and social change outside. And so we see, fear is a key part of not only getting this group motivated and activated politically, but also too in pushing certain folks to adopt this type of view, and adopt, because what Christian nationalism can offer is a very clear explanation of who we are, what we're all about, and where we need to go, and how we need to get there. And in a social context that feels uneven and changing, that very clear narrative and boundaries are really helpful. And so for folks that are feeling fear, whether it's real or perceived, it doesn't matter. It's going to have the same effect. So I think, you're right on. I think fear is a key part of this.
How powerful, or what language is more powerful than the one which has God on your side to then offer power to that vulnerable group that feels not empowered or fearful, right? I mean, like offering that idea of, if you are with us, if you are this, you will become this or have this, right? Talk to me a little bit about that aspect of power as the promise of privilege, almost, or either gaining it or retaining it, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think you're hitting on a really key aspect, where when your political will or view of the world is legitimated in the sacred, that there's nothing more powerful than that. Whoever, and again, you're right to point out, it isn't just Christianity, right? Other world religions do this in other contexts. We see religious nationalism, ebbing and flowing all across the world. And right now, there's a number of countries like the US where we see it really taking on a key part of the discourse. But for groups that feel disempowered, whether that's true or not, again, Christians have never been at a political or religious disadvantage in the US, despite what some may say, that they haven't experienced things like Muslim Americans have, or other religious minorities who have experienced discrimination. But when they feel as though that privilege is being taken away, even moving more towards equality, they feel discriminated against. And so, feeling as though God is on our side and legitimating what we want to see in the will of God, allows us to do kind of whatever we want. And by one quick example, we listen to the words of those that stormed the Capitol at the insurrection. In their own words, they were literally saying, this country's ours, God gave it to us, and we need to do whatever it takes to take it back, because that's what God wants. And so, while that's an extreme view, the fact that for many Americans, that's at least part of understanding of how America should be and work, it allows that extremism to kind of take root.
And yet, you so powerfully explain how different the moral worldviews, as one example, are or the results of like the religious commitment to Christianity and Christian nationalism, and how different these moral worldviews are. I think that's also such a key in like just pointing to how hypocritical in a way this language of some of the people who use Christian nationalism narratives is, right?
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why, for some Americans who have identified as Christian and grown up in those spaces, are either leaving or are saying, well, I'm not a part of this, because they do feel that, wait a second, we were taught these different Christian values of charity and empathy and love and peace and kindness, hospitality. Um, Among other things. And then they see how some who are arguing that this should be a Christian nation, or that Christianity should be privileged, how they're more likely to blame racial minorities for whatever problems they face, or more likely to oppose allowing immigrants and refugees to come here, more likely to be angry at allowing other groups to have a say, or wanting to suppress, democratic norms. And so they're wondering, what, how do we get here? And so I think that is a part of it, that this, again, Christian nationalism, it's a very particular expression of Christianity. And so for those Americans who don't embrace that expression, or perhaps, have moved out of it, that's where they really see this disconnect, whether they leave those churches and find different ones, or they leave the faith altogether. We definitely see a movement there, and especially young Americans and young Christians. The numbers are highest there that are leaving the Christian faith altogether. And when, just anecdotally, when I go share about this book and these findings to I've been to a couple of Christian campuses and shared about this, a lot of the young folks come up and say, this helps make sense of what I grew up in and what I see at, Thanksgiving dinner, each year with the family. Like, this understanding, it helps me distinguish between what I hear taught about Jesus and the way Jesus saw other people and breaking down social boundaries and barriers, versus this idea that we're a Christian nation and it's for us and we need to oppose these different groups. They sense that disconnect there.
Honestly, Andrew, this is so fascinating, and I keep nodding because of so many echoes of the conversations and arguments that go on within Muslim communities, whether of scholars who voice this and point arguments both about the dynamic that you pointed out about young generations leaving Christianity, as well as Muslims who don't like what they see is being said, preached, or done in their name, and with a specific interpretation. So I thought it was really fascinating to also read the way that you described questions of gender and sexuality and the family. But you also explain in the book that the reasons why strong Christian nationalism and personal religious belief bolster these more traditional views of gender and sexuality and family are specific. But I thought that parallel was fascinating. I thought the parallel of young people leaving Christianity is something that many have been pointing out to within this Muslim community. I don't know personally how is it within among Jewish communities as well. But so I wanted to also point to these because you do also acknowledge in your book about this commonalities, I guess, between people from different religions who act in similar ways. And so tell us about this ambassadors or accommodators, everywhere as you call them, and then rejectors and resistors.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, for this book, when we measure Christian nationalism and create scale, this is one way that we measure Christian nationalism, not the only way. But then to make it easier to talk about in the book, we kind of look at these 4 different groups depending on where they fall on this spectrum and this scale. And ambassadors are the strongest at the very top, and then accommodators are those that are at least supportive of this idea, or want to see Christianity as a part of our political project here in the U.S., but not wholeheartedly, or maybe at the detriment of other faiths. And then resistors are kind of the mirror image, where they're a little bit uneasy, maybe a little, undecided about how Christianity should play in this, but definitely feel some trepidation with trying to privilege it. And then rejectors are obviously those that say this shouldn't be a part of it. And what we find is that these folks exist in all different religious communities in the U.S. So it isn't just, again, coterminous with evangelical Protestantism, but we find ambassadors within white Catholic mainline spaces, even among those that are unaffiliated, now at lower numbers than evangelical Protestant. But again, Christian nationalism cuts across these religious traditions. And so that tells us something more about what it means to how they see the social world around them, and that it isn't just about being in this community. And even those that are outside the Christian faith, some might still say, in that sense, Christianity in their words is just talking about something like, Western civilization. It becomes really this ethno-traditional kind of marker, maybe even devoid of any sort of, religious terminology, which we see in other parts of the world with other dominant religions, whether it's Muslim or Hindu or whatever else. And so again, it isn't just Christianity, but here in the U.S., obviously, since that's kind of been the dominant religion, that's where we see it taking place.
Thank you for mentioning that. Actually, I was going to ask you, did you study Christian nationalisms outside of the United States, but specific manifestations that are so different? And again, how it is not necessarily about religion, but now that you mentioned Christian civilization, when we come back to the United States, I think it was also very important that you shed light to the difference between the narrative, Christian nation narrative being used differently from Christian nationalism. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, the way that we think about it is Christian nationalism as a cultural framework contains a number of different things, and one of that is this myth of a Christian nation, or this narrative. But Christian nationalism also contains symbols and value systems and moral frameworks. So it's kind of a larger package of which the Christian nation narrative is a part. So just this Christian nation narrative, we wouldn't say that necessarily is Christian nationalism, but it's a key part of where our social symbols that we hold dear come from and why we would want them there. So, or value systems that we hold dear. And so all of that together is Christian nationalism. So this, Christian nation narrative, as many great historians have written about this, and we cite a lot of their work and really build off a lot of their work, where it wasn't necessarily always this way, but through different points of American history, groups have wanted to make this case and say, hey, we are founded in this particular expression of the Christian faith. And they were arguing for that for a particular reason, and that takes hold. And even today, we have groups that are still doing this work. One is David Barton, who's a political operative. He has a group called Wall Builders, and all he does is try to find any quote that he can use from the founding period or the founding fathers to make a case that, see, they're evangelical Christian just like you, even though any reputable historian would say, yes, Christianity was important in the founding period, but it didn't look like evangelical Protestantism today. And while some, might be within that realm, many were deists, and so it's a lot more, a lot more variation there than the folks that are kind of arguing for this narrative want to make it seem today, for sure.
Speaking about today, let's speak about the future. I mean, you did mention Donald Trump yesterday.
Right.
I think this will air next week. I will put it out very soon. But
yeah.
I was so curious. It was very serendipitous. I was like, oh, I can't wait to hear from Andrew now. So yesterday, on November 15, Donald Trump, who lost the 2020 election, announced he's running for president of the United States again. And I thought it was curious, but not unexpected, that he mentioned movement so much in his speech. This is a task for a great movement. This is not for any one individual. So it seemed pertinent to ask you, what is the future of Christian nationalism in the US related to Trump because of his supporters, as they have benefited from Christian nationalism, but not only to this new news about his candidacy?
Yeah, I think, for us, what we see over and over with the survey data, and then also just kind of how these elements are playing out in real time that Christian nationalism will continue to be a part of our body politic for the foreseeable future. Possibly, I mean, really throughout my lifetime. I mean, it's not going anywhere. It's been with us,
Mine too.
from well before I was born, and it's going to continue on. But I think we're in a moment now where, with Donald Trump, one thing that he was able to do as he was a candidate in 2015 and then throughout his presidency is through his rallies, those functioned essentially as focus groups where he could kind of use different phrases and different ideas and kind of see how the crowd reacted. And one of those, I think, was this Christian nationalist rhetoric, where he's really talking about defending Christianity, defending the Bible, defending God, he even said, in the run up to the 2020 election. And he's gone back to this group. And I think over the course of his time in office, he really saw the power of this rhetoric. And he used it before he won in 2016, but something that's increased. So I think he now is going to be on the campaign trail for the next 2 years. It's just amazing to me that, right, 2 years away, we're essentially preparing for a presidential election. He is going to utilize this rhetoric, and that places it at such a massive part of the discourse. And I think it's not that more Americans are embracing Christian nationalism. We actually find that it's decreasing somewhat. But the importance of this rhetoric to the social discourse, we see it's becoming more salient for those folks that want to see Trump elected, or see themselves as defending this idea of a Christian nation. It's become central in some ways, and even adopting that identity is becoming more likely. Or I can't say it's becoming more likely, we don't have that data, but we find that a significant number of Americans are adopting that identity just like their political leaders. And so it remains to be seen if more do that or not. But I think the salience of it to our public discourse is, I guarantee the next 2 years we're going to be hearing a lot of it. And then from beyond that, we'll see.
Yeah, I have one more question, but I just want to add to this excellent, point that you made. I thought it was frightening what you said in the book, and correct how the ends for this group of people justify the means, or that it doesn't matter the how much Trump is religious or not, is he religious or not. It's that end that matters. And if Trump is willing to deliver what he promises, this group doesn't matter. That's so dangerous. That is so dangerous.
So, well, I think that plays into that element of authoritarian social control, that if there's somebody that will bring order and ensure that, again, we feel safe and what we want will come to pass, the personal religiousness or piety of that individual does not matter. It's whether or not they'll deliver for us. And they found that in Trump. And I think they'll continue to work to those ends. Again, if God has willed it and we legitimate it in the sacred, that's super powerful. And we'll continue to see that play out.
Thank you, Andrew. At the end of each of this conversation, I asked my guest, let's talk about the wider angle of this whole situation in your scholarship. You've addressed it now. Is there anything that you want to add? I thought it was, you said it. I thought it was also very interesting how in most recent piece that you had for the Dallas Morning News, you and your colleague Samuel Perry again wrote that, quote, the transition from Christian nationalist ideology to Christian nationalist identity could be seen as positive or negative for democracy. And so we did talk a little bit about it. If you would like to add anything about just this idea of the wider angle here, please feel free.
Yeah, I think this is kind of the forefront of, one of the forefronts of the research in this area is how many Americans and how strongly do they adopt this identity. And so we write about it in that piece. But really thinking through, what are the implications of this? One is that when they adopt this identity, at least now it's out in the open. And in some cases, that can be a good thing because people will know exactly where you stand. If we know what Christian nationalist means and generally what it means to you, if you identify that way, then we're able to understand where you're coming from. And that's important. a negative, or some of the negative implications, I think, of this is that identities, as we write about, have power. And so when you have groups starting to identify in this particular way, it draws sharp boundary lines. And that means that, they might be or are more willing to ensure that their group is taken care of to the detriment of other groups. And again, as you said, the ends justifying the means. And so that can be really dangerous too, to a democracy, where if there's no way that, if I identify as a Christian nationalist and you do not, if there's no way that we can talk and reason together, or come to an understanding, or at least respect each other's existence, and compromise, then it's really hard to see how a pluralistic democratic society can not only function, but even exist, if that's the end game. And so those are trends that we'll have to continue to follow. And I think for many Americans, Christian, non-Christian, other, minority religions, secular Americans, being able to try to agree upon values that we hold in common, even though we might have very different beliefs, especially about, the nature of the world and the universe, and, religious beliefs or not. If there are values that we can hold in common, like, let's say, different democratic values, then I think that's a place that we can start to be. And so hopefully, a majority of Americans don't embrace this, hard-edged view of Christian nationalism. And so if we can work together across our differences in beliefs to support common values, I think that's a key first step.
Andrew Whitehead, Donald Trump announced his candidacy yesterday. I think you'll be in demand in terms of the insights that you will provide in the next 2 years. I hence really appreciate your time and joining me at Wider Angle today.
Yeah, it's been great being with you. Thanks for the conversation.
And to all of you, stay tuned for more conversations with people from all over the globe. Have a good day. Bye.